fishermen, the sons of Zebedee, until the day the stranger came and said, "Come follow me." His voice was soft and warm but strong, like the rolling ocean deep. His robes without a seam were sewn, like the garment of a priest. His eyes burned with a fire, the like of which they had never known. Neither of them could look away from this man of mystery. He said, "Come to me the way you are, leave that which you meant. Come to me the way you are, I'll make you fishers of men." He stood and waited patiently and said not one more word. Although they did not answer, he knew that they had heard. Their hearts burned with a fire, the like of which they had never known. Neither of them could turn away from this man of mystery. He said, "Come to me the way you are, leave that which you meant. Come to me the way you are, I'll make you fishers of men." They dropped their nets and followed, not really knowing why. There was a power in his voice and truth in his eyes. He spoke with love and compassion, the like of which they had never known. Neither of them could walk away from this man of mystery. He said, "Come to me the way you are, leave that which you meant. Come to me the way you are, I'll make you fishers of men."
All right. What you just heard was a song from John Pulse. He's a musician from Rhode Island. It's a song from a long time ago that I used to listen to a lot when I first received my call to follow Jesus. And I remember walking at night and listening to a song about John and James, who answered the call to follow Jesus and left their nets and followed him. Why don't you go ahead and open up to Matthew chapter 4. We're going to be looking at verses 18 to 22 as we continue this series, Lessons from the Land. All the pictures that we saw, those were all from around the Sea of Galilee, where John and James were, where they received their call from Jesus. We've been looking at the land and from the text, from a context of looking at the historical, cultural, geographical, archaeological, even political climate and context that Jesus entered into, so that we might better understand Jesus' teachings and the stories that have been such a shaping part of our lives, so we can understand what Jesus is calling us to today. We looked at Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. We saw how he was in the shadow of the Herodian fortress, which, looking up from Bethlehem, you could see in the distance, and looking down from the Herodian fortress, you could see little Bethlehem, and the contrast between these two kings, Herod the Great and Jesus, who would become king of the Jews. And then we looked at Egypt, and we talked about how Mary and Joseph had to flee for their lives into the life of Jesus because Herod was trying to kill the child, and so they fled to Egypt, and most likely they went to one of those Jewish communities that was living in Egypt at the time, perhaps on Elephantine Island, where there was a strong Jewish community. Jesus would have taken root in a Jewish community there for a couple of years until Herod the Great died, and they returned back into Israel. But when they returned back, planning on going to Bethlehem, Herod Antipas is ruling in the place of his father, Herod the Great, who had died, and Herod Archelaus. And Herod Archelaus is as ruthless as his father. So Mary and Joseph decided to go up north where Herod Antipas is reigning in Galilee, and they settled down in a place called Nazareth. And this is the place where Jesus will grow in his wisdom and understanding. And now this week we move toward a place, a town that was a growing city called Bethsaida. Bethsaida is to the north of the Sea of Galilee, but it is east of the Jordan River. And it's an important site because up to 6 of the disciples potentially came from Bethsaida. We know Peter and Andrew for sure. In our passage today, we'll see that John and James seem to be in the area working, which probably means they lived there. We know Philip was from Bethsaida because the text tells us that Philip also was from the same town as Peter and Andrew, which was Bethsaida. Philip goes and finds Nathanael, and if they're all working around the same area, Nathanael must be around Bethsaida as well. So up to potentially 6 disciples who lived in the town of Bethsaida. Now this town was turned into a polis, or a city, by Herod the Great's son, Philip the Tetrarch, or Herod Philip, and he had built up that city. So we know there's quite a population in Bethsaida, which is a fishing town in the 1st century A.D. Now, in the New Testament, when it talks about, and Jesus and the disciples crossed over, went to the other side, this is kind of a technical term in the New Testament. And the other side doesn't just mean from one side of the lake to another, although it incorporates that, but it's talking about some political districts here. You can see that this is the northwestern region of Galilee. This is Herod Antipas's area. This is the northeastern region of Galilee. This is Philip the Tetrarch. So they actually split down the middle. And so if you're here in Capernaum and you cross over to the other side, which technically, usually refers to the east, you go to Bethsaida, you have now entered a new political territory. Down here is the Decapolis, which came under direct Roman rule. Down in Judea, that's now under direct Roman rule because Herod Archelaus was kicked out. He was an inept ruler, and that's why Pontius Pilate was on the scene, a Roman governor, in the time of Jesus' ministry. Now, when you crossed over, it made sense to cross over to one of the plains. On the western side, you have the Gennesaret plain. And you can see from this clearing, it's a nice place to be able to land and dock your boat. And over here in the Bethsaida plain, the mountains and the hills are pushed back. Nice plain over here, another place to be able to dock your boat. And so Jesus went back and forth from one side to the other quite frequently in the Gospels. In fact, most of Jesus' ministry, most of his miracles and his teachings occurred in what has become known as the evangelistic triangle. The evangelistic triangle occurs between Bethsaida and Capernaum and Chorazin. And in Bethsaida, this is the area where Jesus multiplies the loaves and the fish for the 5,000. It's also the area that's called, he went away into wilderness or deserted places after John the Baptist was beheaded. And it's also these 3 towns are the ones that Jesus condemns, saying, woe to you! Woe to you, Bethsaida! Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Capernaum! Because if the miracles and the teachings that have been done in you had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes. This is Jesus' ministry area. We're going to look at the calling of the disciples in Bethsaida this week. Next week we'll go over to the other side, and we'll stop in at Capernaum. Now, if you were to go to Israel today, and you were to follow the road signs to Bethsaida, those road signs would lead you to about 1.5 miles to 1.8 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, which is strange if this is a fishing town on the Sea of Galilee. So here in this picture you can see at Tel. This has been, for all purposes, signed as Bethsaida for the last 30 years. Well, you can see in the distance over here is the Sea of Galilee. You can see all through the plain. Now you're back into the wilderness areas. And when you go there, that's probably where you're going to be directed to go to Bethsaida. But when you get there, you'll find that most of the ruins there are from the 9th century BC. So you're looking Old Testament times, David and Solomon. And only a little bit of remains come from the 1st century Roman period, which doesn't seem to have had a high population during Jesus' time, which is strange because we know from texts and evidence that Bethsaida was a very populated town. Herod Philip had built it up into a city. So why is this considered Bethsaida and not some other place? Well, long story short, because this was a place that was found that is to the northeast of the Sea of Galilee, and so you found some Roman remains. Maybe this is Bethsaida, and for tourist purposes, let's make it Bethsaida. But many scholars have debated whether this could have really been, being so far away from the sea, could this really be Bethsaida? And they have postulated that We think Bethsaida is much closer to the modern-day shore. Well, that has been an argument that wasn't really solved until lately. And part of the argument for Bethsaida being so far away at Tel was that, well, the water levels were much higher in Jesus' day. But when you scan the area and do any sort of mathematical calculations, if the water level was as high enough to reach at Tel, then all the other towns that we know were in existence in the first century around the Sea of Galilee would have been submerged underwater. So it's not possible that this would have been the actual Bethsaida and that the water level would have been that high. But in 2017, Dr. Stephen Notley and some others started digging at a new site closer to the Sea of Galilee. And there was evidence found there of a first century city, a rather large one, and a very active fishing industry that occurred in this city. They also found the remains of a Byzantine church with mosaic floors. And the question is this a church that we found in texts, but have never found physical evidence for from the early Byzantine centuries? Dr. Stephen Notley says, excavators have identified the Church of the Apostles, visited by a barbarian bishop named Willibald in 725 AD. He described his journey in which he traveled around the Sea of Galilee, visiting Tiberias, Magdala, Capernaum, and Cursa. On his way, he passed through a place called Bethsaida, where he saw a basilica built over the house of Peter and Andrew. End quote. So we have textual evidence for a church located in this area that was built over what was at that time traditionally known to have been the house of Peter and Andrew. Excavations have continued there, 4 weeks a season, over the last few years, 2017 to 19, and many things have been found. Dr. Stephen Notley was on site the day that I got to visit and see a dig that was going on. In fact, it was the last day of the dig for this season, just last month. And not only was Dr. Stephen Notley there, but we also saw a very renowned archaeologist as well. Not that Dr. Stephen Notley is, because he is as well, but Gabriel Barkow. And he was going around, and he wasn't actually doing anything at the site, he was just looking and very interested and smiling. And so it was neat to see him checking out the site, because this is a very big find. Now, Dr. Stephen Notley served on the faculty of JUC, Jerusalem University College, and I happened to be there with a class at that time from there. And so we got a chance to be able to interview him a bit, and he was able to tell us about the site. And here is a short video clip of some of what was going on that day last month. Here it is pointing out some of the things that we discovered at the site. And here you see the next painting, and here you see the bottom of that pit is the mosaic floor of the church that they found, being uncovered. While we were there, they actually discovered a cache of coins, and it's always going to find a cache of coins filled out for painting purposes. Dr. Notley talked about some of the reasons why this is a much more likely site in Bethsaida than Tel, which is much further away. And so we found Bethsaida, where Jesus had found so many of his disciples. Let's go ahead and read Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 to 22. It says, as Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will make you fishers of men. At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left. They left the boat and their father and followed him. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So in this scene, we see Jesus comes calm. The scene opens with Jesus walking along the Sea of Galilee. And according to John 1:44, a number of disciples had lived here or raised here. In John 1:44, it says Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael and told him, we have found the one that Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets have also written, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. So in our passage, Jesus finds Peter and Andrew, and they're casting their nets into the sea. He goes just a little further, and he finds John and James, and they are preparing, or in some texts, repairing their nets. According to John chapter 1, Philip is from Bethsaida, and Philip finds Nathanael, which probably means Nathanael's in the area as well. Since Andrew and Peter and John and James are here, which means they probably live here as well, are from Bethsaida, they're found working in Bethsaida, it's most likely that the place that they're found working is the place that they're from. What is highly unusual in this text, which without knowing the culture or the context we might easily overlook, is that it's unusual for a rabbi to call his disciples before their first calling. Usually it doesn't work that way. Typically the disciples will come to the rabbi and ask him if they can be his disciples, if they can be his Talmudim. What this reminds us, Jesus taking the initiative, it reminds us that God takes the initiative in seeking us out. Isaiah 65:1 says, I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me, and I was found by those who did not seek me. There's something both humbling and wonderful about that statement. Jesus knows that this is an important point, because in John 15:16, knowing that he has deviated from the cultural norms, he reminds the disciples, saying, you did not choose me, but I chose you. Because God came seeking us, we can know that he has indeed chosen us. We don't have to doubt his love or his commitment to us. If it was completely on our own initiative, we might be right to have some doubts. But it's never on our own initiative, according to Romans 3:11, where it says, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside. But Jesus says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me. So if you have any inclination toward God, it is because God is seeking you. Jesus comes calling in this passage. But we're also reminded that the call to is also a call away. To say yes to one thing is to say no to another. I remember sitting in a class in seminary with Dr. Lehman at Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. And I remember a lesson he told us, and it was very practical, and he was a counseling professor. And he said, you need to figure out what your niche is. What is God calling you to? Because you can't be an expert in everything. So what you need to know is what God has called you to, and begin specializing and learning everything you can in that area. And you can only do that for one or two things. And he says, when you're ready to say yes to something, know that that means no to some other things. And it has to be that way if you're going to do what God has called you to do. The Bible is not a history book. It is primarily a book about spirituality. So when it says that Andrew and Simon were casting their nets, or that John and James were in a boat with their father preparing their nets, and that Andrew and Simon left their nets, and that John and James left the boat and left their father, it's not just telling you facts about an event in history. It's offering you a deep and spiritual truth. In following Jesus, the disciples were choosing to leave another life behind. I remember in my undergrad, we were commissioned to go out in pods of 3, and we were to find some place in the area. We were in Minneapolis, and we were to find some place where we might engage postmodern, non-Christian folks who would meet in the same place pretty regularly so that we could actually form and build relationships with some of the same people. And so we had found a group that we met with. We were pretty sure that they were non-Christian, living a non-Christian lifestyle. And as we got to know them, and they got to know us, and found out that we were Christians from a local Christian university, they started asking questions. And I remember one of the questions that one of them asked said, well, if I'm to be saved, and I'm going to be able to have a relationship with Jesus, Do I have to leave this or leave that behind first in order to be saved, in order to have a relationship with Jesus? And I said, no. No, you don't have to change first in order to be in a relationship with Jesus. I said, but what you do have to know is that as you walk with Jesus, there are going to be some areas where he's probably going to speak to your life and tell you to leave behind some things, to let go of some things. And it'll be at that point where you're going to have to make some of your most difficult decisions. But until that point, I said, I don't even recommend leaving all these things behind until you sense Jesus is inviting you to do it. Otherwise, you'll be doing it in your own strength and by your own will, and it'll become very frustrating and you'll probably fail. And of course, we aren't to think that only certain people need a lesson in letting go. Each and every one of us are constantly being invited to let go. Jesus says it like this: you cannot serve two masters, because you will love one and despise the other, or you'll despise one and love the other. You know, someone said spiritual growth is more a matter of subtraction than it is addition. We accumulate, we hoard, we hold on to for security reasons, and God keeps inviting us to let go. He keeps inviting us to let go of control, to let go of consumption, to let go of certainty, which of course gives us a sense of security, although nothing is really certain. Leaving their livelihood, their trade behind them. Andrew and Peter, John and James were letting go. They were called to something. But in their call to, they will also be called away from something. What is God inviting you to let go of at this stage in your walk with Him? Because to be called to Christ is to be called away from something else. Jesus comes calling, and He calls us to Himself, which is also a call away. And probably the most important part of all of this is that you might know that you are called. In the Jewish synagogue in the first century, it doubled as a number of things. One of those things was it was a school for children during the week. The Jewish children went to school in synagogues starting from the age of 4 or 5, just like our kindergarten. Except for what's a little bit different is when they went to school at the synagogue, they went there to learn Torah, specifically. And as they learned Torah, and as they reached a certain age, about 11 or 12 years old, then some of the kids, some of the students were invited to go further in their studies, to learn Mishnah. Mishnah were the interpretations of the law, and also to be able to go on and study what they know as the writings and the prophets. And so you had a certain segment that made the cut, and they would go on to study Mishnah, and the others would go on to learn a trade, probably with their father. Now, only the best of the best, after they're done studying the Mishnah, were invited to go on to the next level, and that was to go on and seek out a rabbi who they could become a disciple to, a Talmudim. And those who didn't make the second cut would go on a little bit late, but they would also learn a trade, and that's what they would do with their lives. Only a very select few made it to become disciples, and out of them, hopefully, they would become rabbis eventually themselves. So here we are in this calling, and we see the Talmudim. And the purpose of the Talmudim is to become like their teacher, like their rabbi. Now, we see Peter and Andrew and John and James, and they're busy doing something when Jesus calls them. What are they doing? They're fishing. What does that mean? It means they didn't make the cut. They were not invited to continue on studying, to learn to be able to become a rabbi themselves one day. They went and learned a trade, as most people did. And so when Jesus invites them, Jesus, no doubt a well-known rabbi, even by this point, invites them to follow him, this is very unexpected for them. First, their potential to be disciples had already surpassed them. Next, it is very unusual for a rabbi to call the disciples to himself. Usually, the disciples would go to the rabbi and ask him. And these fishermen would have never have imagined, never would have thought to go to the rabbi Jesus and ask if they could be his disciples, because they knew they already hadn't made the cut. They didn't do what was necessary to get to that point. And then after a disciple would typically ask the rabbi would consider whether that disciple was worthy to be called. And what does that mean? Do they have the potential to become like me? To live the life that I live, the yoke, to take upon my yoke, my teaching upon themselves, and to carry it out. But here Jesus chooses and calls them first. And that's why he reminds them in John 15, you did not choose me, but I chose you. There's something very significant about the process that Jesus engaged in and the calling that he called them first. I remember when I was first called, I spent many nights listening to John Pulse and his tape, The Call, walking alone at night. But I remember that when I was called, I was not seeking God. I didn't know God. I wasn't a Christian. I had stopped and finally went to church with my mother because she had been begging me for about 2 years to go to church with her just one Sunday, just give it a try. And I was a nobody from nowhere, a little obscure town in northern Rhode Island that nobody really knows about. And I struggled through grade school. I hardly made it. I'm pretty sure my teachers just passed me. So I remember when I brought home my report card once and had all C's, my parents were delighted. They were like, look, you did it. You passed everything. My sister, who was a straight A student, brought home a B. They're like, Angela, it looks like you're not trying your best here. She's looking at me, she's like, that's how it goes. In school, I was one of the youngest in my class, so I was one of the smaller kids. I was often picked last in gym class because I wasn't really a sporty kid. I wasn't interested in those things. If it wasn't skateboarding, I didn't want anything to do with it. And I was quiet. I was unspectacular in every way, easily overlooked, and that's the way I preferred it. And so even now, I sometimes have a hard time, even when people call me pastor, I know for some of you, it's just so ingrained in you, but like, there's nothing special about where I came from. And I'm glad with that. And because there's nothing special about what I came from, I hate to feel for people to think, oh, you've got a special office, you have a special calling in your life. Because I'm like, if you knew where I came from, you would know that there's nothing special about me or different about me than there is about you. And God calls every single one of us. God has called you. And I'm reminded of that passage in 1 Corinthians where Paul says, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of this world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. Because God called me, I am absolutely convinced that he is calling each and every one of you. The only ones, in fact, that aren't called are those who think too much of themselves. But even for this, Jesus says there's a remedy. In Matthew 23, Jesus said, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted. A precursor to calling is a sober self-assessment. And that sober self-assessment always lands along the familiar lines of a familiar Bible passage. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's why your relationship with Jesus has to start out with a confession. What is confession? It's a sober self-assessment. Because if you don't have a sober self-assessment, there's nothing that Jesus can do with you. There's no place he can take you. Those who think much of themselves Well, they often think little of God. And perhaps the reverse is true as well. And those who recognize their shortcomings, well, in them, God sees potential. You know, it's not uncommon for someone not to get hired to a job because they already know too much about a specific type of skill. Sometimes companies prefer someone who they call trainable. And when they get into an interview and they talk with someone who already has their own ideas and their own solutions and their own way of doing something, they think, unfortunately, you aren't the best person for this job because I need someone who doesn't already know how to do this their way. They want someone who will learn to do it the way that they teach them to do it. I think that God prefers to start at zero. And that's why Jesus didn't call those who excelled already. Jesus said it like this: no one pours new wine into old wineskins. John the Baptist recognized this principle. And upon encountering Jesus, he said, I must become less, and he must become more. God is calling you. You're not ready. And when you realize this, it is then that your calling and your election are sure. Amen? Pray that that was a word for someone today. Let's pray. Father, we give you thanks that we were not the remarkable, that in the world's eyes and by the world's standards, we don't live up. And Lord, help us to not want to live up to that standard. And give us an eyes and a heart and a spirit to discern what your standard is, that we might seek to please you and not please men. And help us in all of our insecurities to know that it is in our weakness that your strength is being perfect. And Lord, I pray today for each one. Some of you are calling to let go of something as they move forward to the next stage with you. For others, perhaps it is a first time call. And they feel you're nudging, and maybe today they realize that that is not of their own doing. But anything that might help them to pay attention to you is a sign that you are calling to them and seeking them. May they not resist. May they come to you as they are, knowing that you love them just as they are, but that you love them too much to leave them that way. And may we all learn to walk with you in humility, but also with joy and gladness, that we might know you, the one true God, in Jesus Christ, whom we have sent. May we hear your call. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.